quest for John Jones, the Manhunter from Mars, his world, and the vile menagerie of villains he must confront.
Hello, it's Frank. It's been a few weeks. I'm sorry about that. Truth is, my current work is really taking all the energy out of me during weekdays, and as the Marvel Superheroes podcast has creeped up to an hour plus a week, I edit that over the weekend, and there just hasn't been a lot of time to do the Idlehead podcast. But also, it's the 60th anniversary of the Martian Manhunter. I've promised to look at 60 years of the character, and that's a heck of a lot of time and energy and bad comics to go through, so that's been daunting as well. But I really want to do something this week, and thankfully I was gifted an article by Chris Sims on Comics Alliance. It was published on February 20th. It's part of his Ask Chris column, 233, Making Sense of the Martian Manhunter. Sims was asked by @RichBurlew, what are the qualities that allow a character to sustain a solo book, and why doesn't Martian Manhunter have any of them? Sims gives a rather lengthy, kind, and thoughtful reply. I wanted to address some of his points, maybe do some clarifications, or offer my own opinions. Sims says he finds the character really interesting, but that he's the definition of an also-ran. He's been around forever, but he's never quite clicked, and I think the simple reason for that is that there's nothing he does that isn't already done better by someone else. And there's a fair amount of truth in that. The Martian Manhunter was developed by Mort Weisinger, Joe Samachson, and Joe Certa. Weisinger was a very powerful editor, but he didn't apparently see enough in this project to shepherd it himself, and instead allowed it to run in Jack Schiff's least popular Batman title, Detective Comics. Meanwhile, writer Joe Samachson departed from the strip after a few installments. He was replaced by Jack Miller, who was an editor who moonlighted as a comic strip writer. You don't hear a lot of people waxing nostalgic about the work of Jack Miller. He was a journeyman, not a particularly passionate or consistent one. He tended to work on lesser DC titles, and it's hard not to see his strips for the character of John Jones to be amiable hack work. Jack Schiff and Jack Miller seem to have a pretty good relationship. Joe Certa liked the work. They managed to craft the better part of 13 years worth of stories. There was a lot of bandwagon hopping. Not a lot of pressure. This was Detective Comics during one of its worst-selling periods. And the only time it seemed like there was a conscious effort to make sweeping changes and try to grab an audience was when the entire creative team was forced out of Detective Comics onto House of Mystery. And despite only spending about 3 years there were essentially 2 distinct runs within that book for the strip. So nobody knew what to do with the character from the very beginning. And no one's reputation is enhanced by losing the cover spot to a book like House of Mystery to Robbie Reed and his H-Dial. Chris Sims posits that one of the Martian Manhunter's main problems is that he's in the shadow of Superman and Batman. He has all the powers of Superman. He has a lot of the MO and demeanor of Batman, but he's not Superman. He's not Batman. Also, being a detective with all of Superman's powers plus more saps drama from the character's stories and makes them difficult to write because how do you write around all those powers? And he rightly points out that one of the major instruments for making that work was the extremely convenient weakness of losing all of those powers to an open flame. The problem I have with this argument is that those two heroes started a book called World's Finest Comics for decades. They're still two of the most recognizable superheroes of all time across the globe and have been for 3/4 of a century. That's a lot to compete with. But the fact remains that every superhero that's followed them has competed with Superman and Batman. Virtually every superhero that's followed has borrowed some elements from one of those two characters. And we have entire universes of characters that are derivative and that can survive as soloists. So what's the Martian Manhunter's problem? One of the big ones, which Sim does mention, is that he is so powerful. He's in the upper echelon of DC heroic powerhouses, which is a very precarious place to be because DC are like mafia enforcers when it comes to keeping Superman especially at the top of the food chain. And anybody who competes with Superman in terms of raw power will inevitably get his ass handed to him by Superman. Now, a lot of superheroes became jobbers to Superman post-crisis. Martian Manhunter was an early adopter of that role. He's been taking hits from Superman since the early Bronze Age, since the 70s. But it really hit its stride in the 90s and early 2000s when Manhunter spent more and more time with Superman and spent more and more time being beaten up by people related to Superman and Superman himself. Another issue is despite appearing in a Batman comic for about a decade and often being treated as a close friend and confidant to the Dark Knight, for the most part, Manhunter only interacts with Batman in Justice League comics. Because the fact is, if you have the Martian Manhunter turning up in Batman stories with his power set, he should be jobbing Batman. Or at the very least, they should have a dynamic as in World's Finest where Superman does the heavy lifting and Batman does the thinking. except Martian Manhunter is supposed to be able to do the thinking for himself, so he just doesn't appear in Batman stories, so he never gets the opportunity to make Batman look bad, especially because since they're in Justice League teams together, usually there's a bunch of other heroes to distract from whatever accomplishments Martian Manhunter is capable of in the presence of Batman. Most of Martian Manhunter's opportunities to shine in the modern era have been in Justice League stories that didn't feature Superman or Batman, which basically means Justice League International, which definitely has a devoted fan base, and a lot of those people have a lot of love for John Jones. But the funny Justice League proved unsustainable without DeMatteis and Giffen, and also Grant Morrison reintroduced the concept of a pantheon of DC heroes, a magnificent seven, of which Martian Manhunter was a part and received a great promotional push in the late 90s because of that. But it also meant that he was the least well-known and the least popular member of DC's greatest super team, and it also meant that the types of characters that he interacted well with and gave him an opportunity to show off around were relegated to secondary teams. In the JLI, John Jones is a contender. On the JLA, it puts an underline under that also ran heading. On his best day, John Jones is Brian Epstein. On the worst, Pete Best. Well, in all honesty, Derek Taylor. The only Martian Manhunter ongoing series to ever exist was produced by John Ostrander and Tom Mandrake. And the character was also getting a big push in JLA under Grant Morrison and Howard Porter, as well as frequent appearances in miniseries and specials related to JLA. And Sims points out that at this time, they were trying to make Martian Manhunter appear to be as important as the other JLAers, even Superman, pointing out that he was protecting the rest of the world where the JLA tended to patrol their individual respective cities within the United States of America. But outside of the U.S., Manhunter was more visible and often more popular than Superman. Sims also references the awesome concept conceived by Dan Curtis Johnson and J.H. Williams III for the Chase series, where they came up with a team that existed between the World War II era Justice Society and the shifting modern era heroes of the Justice League called the Justice Experience, which were set in the late 60s, early 70s. They were all a bunch of cast-offs, losers. They were mostly doing it for kicks, but they were still trying to be a superhero team at a time when there weren't any superheroes. And they managed to tick off one particularly unpleasant inventor by the name of Dr. Trap, who became a serial killer and wiped out the entire team. In the Ostrander series, one of those characters, the Bronze Wraith, was retconned into being an alternate identity for the Martian Manhunter, which marked one of several occasions where the Manhunter was established as existing in that time period between the two great super teams, the guy who worked in that gray period that lacked for heroes, making him among the most veteran and experienced heroes without anybody knowing it because he's working in secret, using assumed identities. That conceit goes back to the creation of the character, because in 1955, there weren't any other superheroes, and in fact, Martian Manhunter himself wasn't treated as a superhero. It was a few years into his run before he started to shift into the mode of being this alien powerhouse. Before that, he was essentially a plainclothes detective who solved mysteries using alien powers. So in true history, he served in that role. Also in 1977, Steve Englehart came up with a story, The Origin of the Justice League -1, I believe it was called, that established the League as coming into existence in the exact same chronological frame as their publication history. So he had Martian Manhunter arrive on Earth in 1955, and he meets a prototype of the Justice League in 1959 who don't get together and form the actual team until 1960. Since we never saw a story where John Jones met the other heroes that he formed the Justice League with, it served a great purpose. Plus, it established Manhunter as being a character who had to operate in the McCarthy era in secret during the midst of Red Scare, while also playing up the frenzy revolving around Orson Welles' broadcast of the War of the Worlds during the Depression. That concept became more firmly ingrained in the DC universe after the Zero Hour event of 1994, where the final issue featured a gatefold chronology of the DC universe that again reaffirmed Martian Manhunter's arrival in 1955, which meant that Superman wouldn't turn up until around 1982, 1984 as of 1994, because if I recall correctly, it was a 10 to 12 year timeline. It's also worth noting that prior to Zero Hour, Manhunter appeared in a 3-issue 1992 miniseries that was set in 1957, but its place in DC canon has always been in question. Still, period story. And to me, that's one of the Manhunter's strengths and one of the areas where he works best. And it seems that Sims agrees with this. When he's out of the shadow of Superman and Batman, when he's working in areas, whether parts of the world or time periods that are foreign to Superman and Batman where they don't normally play, that's where Martian Manhunter belongs. His place is to fill those voids that lack for the world's finest duo. Let me read another passage from Sim's piece related to the Bronze Wraith. What makes it so interesting is that it shows that he was trying to be a superhero long before the world was ready for him, and that, quote-unquote, the Martian Manhunter is an identity that he only adopted after Superman showed that the world could accept an alien superhero. It's an idea that Sims attributes to Mandrake and Ostrander, but in fact, that story was told in a Superman, I believe it was a Man of Steel annual, I think by Louise Simonson several years prior. Anyway, back to Sims. It's a great little piece of character history that not only shows how dedicated John was and how much experience he has with superheroics, but also how isolated he was from humanity and how much Superman changed everything. I agree, and that was a great concept for the pre-Flashpoint, pre-New 52 DC universe. I'm not sure how well that works now because I think part of the point of having the New 52 and making sure that all the heroes arrive at roughly the same time is to allow Superman to still be the first superhero of that lot. So if you have the Martian Manhunter precede Superman, it negates the whole rationale of the New 52 and it undermines Superman in a way where he can't recover as he did in the post-crisis revisions. Back to Sims. The biggest problem with DC's post-crisis universe, from a structural standpoint anyway, is figuring out how to preserve Superman's status as the center of this new heroic age when there were already superheroes and mystery men fighting crime back in the 40s. With the simple idea of John trying and not succeeding, only to go on and become a core member of the Justice League for years, the change brought about by Superman's arrival becomes indisputable. He continues, that stuff's all really interesting and compelling, but it also kind of tanks him as a solo character too, because all those ideas tie him into being part of the Justice League. It's what defines him. He's a team player in search of a team, the person who's isolated from humanity, whose only true identity is the superhero. Now, there's truth in what Sims says because for most of the last several decades, John Jones has been defined as a Justice League member, often the Justice League or the heart and soul of the team, the guy who keeps coming back, keeps showing up, even when the team is not at its best, often being a bright spot in times involving trips to Detroit or guys like General Glory joining the ranks. But it's also a major fallacy that is consistently perpetuated by modern creators. The notion that the Martian Manhunter came into existence sometime around 1986, that he came into existence with the exception of his time in the original Justice League of America, the only other thing he ever did was join Justice League Detroit, be a part of JLI, be a part of JLA. And it forgets that character did have 13 years of solo stories, quite a few solo appearances or team-up appearances throughout the Bronze Age. He's had miniseries, he's had specials. There is lore for that character. Virtually no one has ever even attempted to draw from that. The closest I would say was when Grant Morrison resurrected the concept of the human flame for his Final Crisis miniseries, but that ended up being a bit of a cheap shot because it was just an opportunity to have a shock death of the Martian Manhunter in the very first issue. It was such a cheat because you bring back the human flame, you have him fight a few people, you show off that he's a bit of a loser, which doesn't do John Jones any favors, and John Jones never has an opportunity to address that character because he's forgotten and then the entire universe is rebooted. It's one of a great many examples of something being set up for John Jones and never fully coming to completion because no creators ever respect anything any previous creators did with regard to that character unless it happens in the Justice League title. Sims talks about how Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman work fine without being part of a team, but Manhunter has to be a part of the team. But the fact is, there has been no series where Manhunter is allowed to fully exist outside of the Justice League since the Bronze Age, with the notable exception of Martian Manhunter American Secrets. Everything else at least has guest appearances by the Justice League. One of the great failings of the Ostrander Mandrake ongoing series was they decided that the JLA should be the supporting cast for the Martian Manhunter, and the Martian Manhunter should not have any life outside of being a superhero, which is something that Sims seems to applaud, but the problem is, from a storytelling standpoint, you just have a spin-off of JLA. You don't actually have a Martian Manhunter title because you're not giving him the opportunity to form his own supporting cast, to have his own identity. And there's a subtext to that where the creators are telling the audience that they don't feel this character is capable of functioning on his own, when in fact the character came into existence on his own at a time when being in a Batman title was not doing him any favors. And he managed to have 13 years worth of appearances in 2 different titles, over 100 stories. They exist, but nobody takes any use of them. I'm not saying that they're the greatest stories. I started out this podcast saying that Jack Miller was hacking this stuff out, but there are nuggets in those stories. There is continuity. There are characters that form a supporting cast that makes the Martian Manhunter a sustainable character character because he had to be, because if he wasn't, he wouldn't have held on to those titles for as long as he did. When Julie Schwartz took over Detective Comics and booted Manhunter out, Jack Schiff could have just decided to try to do something entirely different with House of Mystery, but he felt that the Manhunter from Mars concept was strong enough that he ported the entire creative team from Detective to House of Mystery and made it a cover-featured, ongoing serial in what had previously been a sci-fi horror anthology. Jack Schiff believed in the Manhunter. Jack Miller and Joe Certa had enough affection and stories to tell with that character to last for many, many years. And if you're going to pay lip service to telling solo Martian Manhunter stories, it might do you some good to take the effort to find out how Martian Manhunter stories were done prior to his becoming a Justice League adjunct character. It's a gripe that I find is something of a plague on comics. There's always been a tendency for readers to go for the book that gives them the biggest bang for their buck. I know I grew up on team-up books, and I grew up on team books, and so did a lot of other people. And there are some characters that are defined more by their appearances in team books than they are by their solo titles because they have a much broader audience. Wonder Woman is a character who is very much plagued by this. There are so many writers that think they know who that character is and then contort her and diminish her because all they know is how she relates to the Justice League, and that's not who that character is. You really can't define Wonder Woman by her appearances in Justice League comics because it's a pale shadow of who the character was created to be, what she means to the greater world. Martian Manhunter is a great character within the Justice League. Most people, myself included, fell in love with this character through his appearances in team books. It's just that there's more to him than those team books, and he cannot grow unless there is some consistency in his development as a soloist that sets him apart from the Justice League. If the character is at his best when he has an opportunity to fill a void within the DC universe, stuffing him on a team with all their iconic characters where he is the least among a Magnificent Seven is not doing him any favors. And as Sim states in his article, first, as is usually the case in comics, just because the Martian Manhunter hasn't ever really worked as a solo character doesn't mean that he can't. It just means that it hasn't happened yet. If you'd asked me 5 years ago, I'd probably say the same stuff I'm about to say about Hawkeye, except for the part where I actually like the Martian Manhunter. All it really takes is the right team with the right take to come along to make it work. And the great thing about superhero comics and the sheer number of people who are working on creating these massive shared universes is that this happens pretty regularly. Chris Sims adds a line, "Of course, that said, if John Ostrander and Tom Mandrake couldn't make it work, I've got a hard time believing anyone could." And speaking as a fan of their work on titles like Grimjack and The Spectre, I can say that they just were not good choices for that series, that they did not have a strong understanding of the character, and they very clearly did not do any research into the character's solo stories. They drew almost entirely from relatively recent tales of the character in JLA and JLA Year One. If Martian Manhunter's name is on the cover, why is the book full of characters from the recently canceled Chase series and Jack Kirby's Fourth World Saga? How is it that Director Bones from the DEO made more appearances than Diane Mead? How come Despero was never mentioned, but Darkseid kept popping up like that was any kind of a draw, considering that John Byrne couldn't sell Darkseid at that point in time, nor Walt Simonson? That's a gripe for another day. If you don't do the research, and if you're not acclimated to the type of character that John Jones is, that fantastic sci-fi superhero, then you are a poor choice. And I could spend all day telling you creators that I would have enjoyed working on this character or would enjoy seeing in the future, but I think the better play would be to address the challenge of Rich Burlew. As a Martian Manhunter fan, I could go on and on about story elements that I'd love to see pop back up and be addressed, avenues that were not pursued that I think would be interesting, but that would be trying to squeeze everything I ever wanted to do with this podcast into one episode. I think, considering I try to keep this thing under 20, 30 minutes, probably time to wrap it up. So instead, I can offer a couple of suggestions that anyone working on the character could incorporate that would improve his chances at surviving in the market and resonating with readers. It goes back to Chris Sims' central thesis that the Martian Manhunter is in competition, direct competition with Batman and Superman within their own universe, within their own super team. And my answer is to turn into the Skid. As I mentioned before, famed Superman editor Mort Weisinger was involved in the development of the character of John Jones. J.M. DeMatteis introduced elements into the Martian Manhunter lore that were extremely similar to Weisinger-era Superman. People who grew up on Superman in the post-crisis age are used to seeing him as a well-adjusted kid, grew up on a farm, has living parents, has good relationships with other people. But if you go back to Superman of the Silver Age, this is a fellow who, to a large degree, was not very well-adjusted. twisted. If you subscribe to Jules Pfeiffer, Superman in the form of Clark Kent is actually having a negative critique of humanity. He's not someone who fits in. He is someone who is extremely intelligent and beyond worldly. He's galactically wizened through his travels. He doesn't relate very well to humanity. He does weird alien things that generate interesting, controversial, super dickery covers and propelled Superman sales throughout the 50s and 60s. An element that was lost in Superman post-crisis was pathos. What this character spent a lot of time doing was going back in time and trying, yet failing to save Krypton over and over again. Despite all of his extraordinary powers, he could not save that world that was fated to be doomed, and by extension doomed him to solitude for the rest of his life. It was a time when the term "the last son of Krypton" had meaning. There was no one else like Superman. He was a man of steel in a world full of women of Kleenex. The Superman of the 1950s was not a human. He was not an American. He was a Kryptonian first. And his inability to reconnect with Krypton, his longing to be with people with whom he could relate, gave that character an incredible depth and appeared to reflect Mort Weisinger's own psychological quirks. It reflected the survivor's guilt of a Jew living in America who recognizes that much of his people and culture had been lost just a few years earlier to genocide. And here's a fellow who, with great drive, had plunged into the American experience, very ambitious, had acquired authority over the Man of Tomorrow in all media, as well as much of DC Comics, but was friendless, widely hated for his ruthlessness. Very anglicized, and yet in middle life is pushing for stories that are very nostalgic and very reflective of a possible life that he could not live and that had been lost for his people. This was a central aspect of Superman during arguably his greatest popularity and resonance with culture that was lost, at least beginning with the Richard Donner movie, which emphasized his romantic relations and his connectedness to humanity. You cannot go back to the Weisinger Superman. That era is long gone. It's unattainable by Superman, as evidenced by the many instances of creators trying to reach back to that era. That Earth has been salted by the post-crisis reconception of the character. But the Manhunter from Mars can. So perhaps instead of reading old, hoary, not terribly commercial Martian Manhunter stories, someone who wants to tell quality Manhunter stories in this day and age should perhaps investigate the Silver and Bronze Age Superman. Because one of the ways in which the Martian Manhunter is different from the modern Superman is in his alienness, in his foreignness, in his personal, irreconcilable tragedy. This is a man who grew up on Mars to adulthood, took a wife, raised a child. They are both dead. His extended family is dead. He watched them die with his own eyes, and he cannot turn back time to correct that. There is no Lois Lane waiting for him, and even if there were, it would be a poor replacement for the society that he's lost forever. Superman had the Phantom Zone criminals who had survived the destruction of their home world, but were so deranged and evil that they'd been exiled to another dimension. So here's a surviving connection to Superman's homeworld, but they were a twisted, contorted, funhouse mirror reflection of the world that he'd lost. In the case of Mars, you're likely to have survivors of that world who've spread throughout the galaxy who are at least as traumatized and perhaps more so than John Jones, psychotic. And there are a lot of very interesting stories you can tell about those types of damaged people interacting. Even the good Martians would be carrying such a burden that it may be torturous to even see another Martian. And those are stories I think that are worth telling. And I do believe that that would resonate with modern audiences. But another option is you look at Batman. Whenever you have a character like the Joker going up against Superman, I personally find that very tedious because there's nothing that the Joker can do directly to Superman beyond whipping out some kryptonite, which is something Lex Luthor does every other month. Why would it be more interesting for the Joker to do that? So typically what he has to do is attack the supporting cast of Superman. And we're supposed to get tense over the possibility of Jimmy Olsen biting the dust. Also, at one point, they tried to take the Toy Man, a villain oft used for reasons that escape anyone with common sense, and turn him essentially into a Batman villain. Turn him into a serial killer, a killer of children, tell a very dark story where you pay off the threat of doing harm to someone that Superman cannot save. And many regard those Toy Man stories as among the worst ever produced for Superman because of how inappropriate it is for a character like Superman. You can't tell those kinds of stories with Superman because he's not built for that especially in the modern era, as I just discussed. He's a guy who's well-adjusted. He's a guy who has a happy life. He's a much more aspirational character now than he was in the 50s. But you can take a Toyman type character and have him do that type of stuff in a Martian Manhunter story. John Jones is more vulnerable than Superman. His stories are allowed to be defeatist, where a Superman story needs to be optimistic. Martian Manhunter can allow for fantastical elements that wouldn't fit in a Batman story, but he can go to those dark, grim places that are often reserved for Batman stories or characters that are even more compromised than the Dark Knight. So what you do is you upconvert the Batman style rogues gallery, which is something that Ostrander and Mandrake actually attempted to do. They took the Joker and gave him most of the complement of Martian powers, and they renamed him Malefic. This was a villain who maniacally took on the JLA and was able to do some serious damage. He was a legitimate threat. The problem with Malefic is that in a series that ran for 3 years, about a year and a half worth of stories were devoted to Malefic or featured him prominently, exhausting the appeal of the character in that short span of time. But what if you took Ultra Multi-Alien and made him a space-age Two-Face who could have magnets shooting out of his arm and electrical bolts shooting out of his leg? What if you took Solaris and made him a penguin-style gangster with the reach of a solar system? When you think about it, Hyathis is basically Poison Ivy on a cosmic level. Lobo could substitute for Bane. Starro and Eclipso operates in a manner not dissimilar from the Mad Hatter, but on a greater scale. What if you took Gotham City and turned it into a mobile, multicultural alien city like, say, Haven the Broken City, which was around in the early 2000s? And if you didn't read that series, I recommend it. I don't think DC owns it 100%. I think that the creators had some sort of a participation deal, so you never see Haven anymore, but I'm just using it as an example. You take all the basic tropes of Batman stories, and you add superpowers and strange machinery and even supernatural elements, and you have the Martian Manhunter confront that. You wouldn't even necessarily have to go back and use his old villains, but it would be very easy to take a bunch of those guys who mostly only appeared one time anyway, flip through a copy of Martian Manhunter Showcase Presents, pick out Malador the Sorcerer, and tell a new story with him where you could essentially do anything you wanted to with the character. There's not a huge fan base to contradict you, but you might find little nuggets that would inform your story that would be interesting and would differentiate them, as opposed to taking a full-on analog of a Batman rogue and just giving them superpowers. It's simple. Anyone could do it. So those are just two ideas, floating them out there. Pretty much any writer could use them.
Your ego betrays you. Will you not listen to reason? This won't end well for you.
We received a WordPress blog like from Charlton Hero, retweets from The Anti-Fascist, Ange, Between the Pages, Bob at RJ Holmes 123, Charlton Hero, Count Druncula, Dread at Dr. 13 is the Beast, Eternal Rage, Fantastiverse, Firestorm Fan, Flotospan, Guano Man, Knowing Flame Comics, Legion Bloggers, Longbox Graveyard, Oscar Olalde, Randy Caldwell, Ryan C. at Trash Film Guru, Siskoid, and the Ultraverse Network, as well as favorites from The Anti-Fascist, Charlton Hero, Count Druncula, Date Night at Red City Images, David Golding Artist, Django X Fett, Eternal Rage, Irredeemable Shag, It's Plastic Man, Luke Dobb, Mark Burkhart, Mark Eric Barch, Martin Gray, Oscar Olalde, Portland Timbrose, Professor Riptide, Randy Caldwell, Sean Corey, Sets Fiend, Simon Donovan, Siskoid, and the Top 5 Road Crew. Of the episode 60 Years of Martian Manhunter in 1953, which spotlighted the Rokar solo story, Siskoid wrote, "Great podcast and descendant of the Idlehead. Love the atmospheric music. I wasn't aware of the original Manhunter from Mars story, so really interesting. And though it doesn't have the hilarious banter of MSH, referring to the Marvel Superheroes podcast, the short length doesn't let it become boring. You've got a regular listener." On the Despero episode, Siskoid said, "Kalinor sounds a heck of a lot like Kalinors, which is the French translation for the Care Bears. Add a little accidental humor to the podcast from this listener's perspective." Of 60 Years of Martian Manhunter in 1955, covering the first two stories featuring John Jones, Siskoid wrote, "Nice suite of accents. Now do mine." Ange wrote, "Dang, I was about to suggest Writings from the Red Planet for our mailbag section. Thanks for another great show. I have never read the earliest Martian Manhunter stories, so this was definitely educational. I am fascinated by the array of powers he had even in these first stories. It makes the simple weakness stand out a bit odd. I wonder if the baseball story was somehow inspired by It Happens Every Spring, which starred Ray Milland. I do think that mixing this podcast up between story reviews, villain spotlights, supporting cast information will keep the format fresh. I like the Despero episode a lot, and this one was certainly educational. As for Pad's Supergirl, we are in complete agreement. I would hold those first 50 issues up against many long arcs. It is just a fantastic long arc of discovery and redemption. And you are right that it skirted Vertigo with its supernatural and religious overtones. This wasn't simply a female Superman. Then 51 through 75 came out, trying another redemption arc for Linda Danvers, this time with a more classic Superman power base, no more angelic stuff, and the DCAU costume. That 2-year arc lasted about 1 year too many. Still, I consider that series one of the highlights of Supergirl's history, even though it is pretty far from Kara Zor-El and is reviled by many, their loss. Count Druncula wrote, another great episode. The dramatic readings and character voices are silly in just the right way. It offers variety and spice to the normal story review. I read this story a couple years ago in Showcase Presents Martian Manhunter. I didn't remember it very well, so this episode was a nice reminder. Well, nice might not be the best word since the story was pretty mediocre. I remember it taking quite a while for DC to figure out how to balance the detective angle with the alien powers in a way that wasn't utterly contrived. I guess I'll confirm that idea as you chronicle the series. Charlton Hero wrote of the Multiversity episode, love the show, man. Looking forward to scouring the archives. Thanks for joining the team this round. Hope you come back in round 6 in 4 months. Kyle Bidding writes, Frank, I've really enjoyed your first 4 episodes. Martian Manhunter has always been a character I've enjoyed but not known a whole lot about. I've only ever read him when he's crossed over with characters like Superman and Batman. I always enjoyed when he showed up in World's Finest, or been a constant member of a team like the Justice League. I've always enjoyed the crazy Martian Manhunter knowledge dumps you've had over at Fire and Water, so I'm really looking forward to more episodes of this podcast dedicated just to MM. I'm looking forward to future episodes. Eternal Rage wrote, Multiversity very well put together, albeit short. Much more questions and a heightened interest for me. Between the Pages wrote, great episode, so I should avoid Elseworlds unless I want to see the Martian Manhunter burn to death, and included some emoticons with flames and gray aliens. Floatuspan wrote, great post for hashtag SBTU, that Superblog team up, and I am over the moon to find a dedicated John Jones blog. This is on my follow list. Randy Caldwell wrote, I'll be ready in November and daily Martian Manhunter photos for the 60th anniversary. Guano Man added, I've been hoping someone would do a JJ podcast. Thank you. Missed the first ones, but catching up. Finally, a number of people asked me about the recently announced Martian Manhunter series. Specifically, Ange tweeted, I assume you're getting the Martian Manhunter book. If you're in, I'm in. Well, the fact is, I'm probably not going to pick up that book. I have not bought a new Martian Manhunter comic from DC since the first issue of the 2006 miniseries. I don't think the company has any idea what to do with that character, and it's something I'll get into in greater depth on our next episode. Feel free to leave a comment. Our blog is at the idlehead of Diabolu.blogspot.com. Although if you put in the word idlehead or Diabolu, typically that blog is the first result. You can also go to Worlds Behind Podcast, the WordPress account, which is great if you don't want to have to log in. Anybody can comment there. And of course, there's my Twitter account at Commander Blanks, all of which is linked through the blog. So if you can find one, you can typically find the other through that. Thanks, everybody.